So my wife and I, when we first got married, we decided to go snowboarding. And I had been a few times, not enough to be like proficient, but enough to stay on my feet. My wife had only been like once or twice though. And so we take the ski lift up to the very top, and we decide we're gonna start at the top, and then we're just gonna go all the way down together. And my wife was like, should we like do the bunny slopes first and like kind of like get our legs under us? And I was like, no, we got this. And so we get on the ski lift and we start heading up. And this is always like the most anxious part of skiing for me, snowboarding, is being on that ski lift, because I know I'm gonna wipe out. You know, I don't know if it's just a me problem, but I cannot get off of that lift because there's a little bit of a jump without falling and knocking down like 4 other people with me. And so the whole time I'm like stressed about, because then someone's got to stop the thing and then everyone's looking at you. And sure enough, we get to the top, and I don't know if it was me or if it was her, or if it was one of the people with us, but we all wipe out. They had to stop the thing. Everyone's looking at us. We kind of crawl away in our shame. And then we get over to the bench, we strap our feet in, and we start going down the mountain. And really quickly it became apparent that Mia needed to like take some more time to refresh her skills, because she was like standing up and then falling, and then up and then down, and then up and then down. And we were kind of on a steep part of the hill, and so it wasn't a good place for her to like figure it out. And I was starting to get a little antsy. I was like, man, I'm ready to snowboard, but I'm kind of just like standing here waiting for her to like figure this out. And so I kind of like think to myself, okay, she'll learn eventually. I'm gonna take off and I'll meet her down the mountain because I really want to snowboard. And she's done this before, so she'll figure it out. So I say, hey Mia, I'll see you down at the bottom. And so I take off, and I'm enjoying myself, and I'm going. And then I get to this fork in the road, and I start feeling guilty. I'm like, I probably shouldn't have left her. Like, that was impatient of me. And so I stop at the fork, and I decide I'm going to wait for Mia to catch up, and then I'll be a good husband and hang out with my wife. And so I'm sitting there, and time goes by, and she's just nowhere to be seen. And so I'm just sitting. So I realize, like, oh, man, I shouldn't have left her there. And so I take off my snowboard, and I start hiking back up. And I'm like I'm envisioning all the things that could have gone wrong. And then I see at the top of the hill, like the injury cart coming down. You know how like there's like on the bobsled or whatever, the snowmobile, and they like have the body bag in the back that they drag on a sled. And I see that, I'm not even kidding. I see it. It's like orange and everything. And I look up and I'm like, oh no, like that's probably my wife. Like my mind's jumping to the worst case scenario. And as it gets closer, I see it is my wife. She's sitting in the back and she's in the little injury sled. And so I'm freaking out. I'm like, oh, my fault. And as it gets closer, I see she's smiling, and she's just like waving at people, and like it's a parade. And I'm like, what in the world? And she gets closer and closer, and then she sees me, and then her smile disappears, and she's just like scowling. And she was going like a lot faster than I was, because I was just on my feet at the time, and she's just like looking at me. And she continues down the mountain. So I put my board back on, and I make it back down. And I get down there, and I was like, are you okay? Like, what happened? And she's like, yeah, I'm fine. And she said, I'm fine. So I know I'm in trouble, right? But she says, I'm fine. And I was like, what happened? She's like, nothing. I don't know how to snowboard, and I was stuck at the top. And the workers saw me, and they're like, hey, you should probably go to the bunny slopes. And I agreed. And I was like, okay, well, that's good. So let's go to the bunny slopes. And it wasn't good. I had to apologize. But she asked me, she's like, why did you leave me up there? Like, I don't know how to snowboard, and you literally left me at the top of a really steep part of the hill to just figure it out by myself. Like, I don't know how to snowboard. And I felt terrible because I could sympathize, right? I understand that was my bad. I shouldn't have done that. And this is a position, right, being alone and being out of our depth, and that was something I could really sympathize with. And this is something we find ourselves in probably often, where we find ourselves in a situation where we feel like we're out of our depth, where we don't know what we're doing, we feel alone, we feel stuck, and then we look down at the mountain in front of us, and we're like, how am I going to accomplish this? And this is something I want to take to Scripture today, because this is a story we're going to see, where oftentimes God will put us in these positions. And we find ourselves stuck, and we find ourselves alone, and then we ask this question, God, why am I here, and why aren't you with me? God, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how I'm going to get down from here. I don't know why you put me in this position, but I feel stuck, and I feel alone, and I don't know what to do. And so what do we do when God seemingly puts us in this position and then just leaves us? Because I'm sure you felt like that before. I have. God, why would you let me find myself here, and why would you just leave me? I feel stuck. I need direction. Where are you? And so I want to turn to this passage in Judges. And we're wrapping up our series on Lead Me. And there's an element of God's leadership that shows up here that I think is going to be really helpful to all of us. And so if you would turn to Judges chapter 6, we're going to be in chapter 6 and chapter 7 today. And we're going to be talking about this guy named Gideon. He was one of the judges that showed up before Israel had a king. He was someone that God used to lead his people. But we're going to look at this relationship between God and Gideon and kind of see how God showed up and see how God led him in a place where Gideon was very uncertain. So Judges chapter 6, starting here in verse 1, it says this: "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hand of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds." So we get the setting of the scene here, and Israel's in a really bad way. The Midianites are their neighbors. There was this tribe, this people group, this country that was right next door to them. And they were bigger and they were more powerful at this time. And so basically what they were doing was every time Israel would have a harvest, they would come over with their army and their raiding parties, and they would just take all of Israel's stuff. And Israel couldn't do anything about it. And this would happen so often that they actually made shelters, like second homes for them up in the mountains, because they would just go and hide. When they saw the Midianites coming, they say, all right, we got to go hide. And they would grab as much as they could, but ultimately they've got all their fields full of harvest, and they had to just leave, and the Midianites would come and they'd take them. And this happened year after year. The Israelites were stuck. And they found themselves saying, God, where are you? And they cry out to God, and then this is God's response in verse 9. After the Israelites cry out to God, God says this: "I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you, and I gave you their land." So basically saying, hey, you're right to cry out to me because I am your Savior. I'm the one who got you out of Egypt. But then he says this: "I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not listened to me." So the Israelites are saying, God, where are you? And then God responds by saying, you remember the first commandment? Rule 1 of 10? Well, you broke rule 1. We haven't even gotten to number 2, 3, or 4 yet. You broke the first rule I gave you. And he's saying to the Israelites, hey, this is your fault. Because God has told them time and time again, if you follow my ways, you will be blessed. But if you try and do things on your own, my hand will be against you. And God has told them over and over again, do things my way and I will bless you. You will live the best lives that I have for you if you do things my way. But they don't. And this is a promise we see in Scripture that applies to us too. God is telling us, I have a good way for you to live. I have rules in place that are for your good, that are for your benefit, that will bring blessings on you and your family. And if you do things my way, you will be so blessed. And yet so often, we ignore God's commands and we ignore God's way. And we say, all right, God, I'll do some of these things your way, but I really don't trust you with this part of my life. And the Israelites find themselves in this position. And they're reaping the consequences of their failures. And yet, even though God says, look, just follow my rules, and even though at any point they can turn and they can follow God's rules and they can make the changes, and they're stuck in their sin, God still comes in and saves them. He has no need to. He's already given them the law. He's already showed them how they can live in a way that would save them. But they're not listening, and he steps in. And it says this: he sends an angel to Gideon, and it says this: the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Now, Gideon is in a winepress. This is an important observation because you don't thresh wheat in a winepress. That's where you make wine. You thresh wheat on the threshing floor, which is this big open space. And it's better for threshing wheat because the wind will come and blow the chaff away and do all the work for you, essentially. But he's in a he's in a wine press. So essentially what we see is Gideon is hiding. He knows the Midianites could come, and so he's deciding to take care of his work inside this wine press. It's going to take much longer, but there he can hide. And while he's hiding away, while he's cowering away, God comes up and says, hey, mighty warrior. This is a perfect example of biblical humor, right? This is a perfect example of humor in the Bible. Yesterday we had this serve day. And I always end up on painting duty, which is just beyond me because I'm not a good painter. And I was in the bathroom and I was painting, and I was with some like really good painters. Like Bill was there, he was painting, and he doesn't paint for a living, but he's a good painter. And then Bruce was there, and he's a good painter. And then there was me, and I ended up like being in charge. They call it cutting. So I was like supposed to be like against, like in the corners and on the baseboards, the part that you can screw up the most. Like with a roller, at least like you can miss, and you got a whole wall. But I'm here like with this little brush, and God bless me, I was trying so hard, but I just kept getting it on the edges. And if one of those guys would have come up to me and said, Micah, you are the best painter I have ever seen, with all these drips on the floor and with paint all over my arms and all over the baseboards. If Bill would have come up to me and said, Micah, you should be a painter for a living, I would have been insulted, right? Like those are kind words, but that's insulting because I know, and my work is showing for me that I'm not a good painter. And essentially that's what we see happening with Gideon here. Gideon is cowering away, and then this angel comes up and says, whoa, hey there, mighty warrior, right? And so it's this funny thing. It's like, you're on the couch and you're taking one of your self-care days, and you just polished off a bag of chips, and now you're working on the ice cream and your gut's hanging out. That shirt that used to fit you really nice is now feeling a little tight, and then your spouse comes in and says, whoa, you should be on the cover of Fitness magazine, right? Like those are kind words, but that's an insult. And we see that happening here with Gideon, right? Gideon's here, he's hiding, and an angel comes and says, hey, tough guy, what are you doing? And then we see Gideon's response. And this is funny. I really think this is biblical humor, because Gideon comes back and he gets all defensive. And he says this in verse 13. He says, pardon me, my Lord, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all of his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hands of the Midianites. And so this angel comes, and he kind of like insults Gideon. And then Gideon responds. He says, whoa. If God is so good and God saved us from Egypt, why are we in this situation? If God loves us, you're going to call me a mighty warrior. If God's a mighty warrior, why isn't he saving us? We're his people after all. And Gideon has a valid point, right? He's threshing wheat in a wine press. He's hiding away. They've spent the last 7 years under the suppression of the Midianites. And so where's God? And then we see God respond. And in 13, the angel responds. And it says this in 14, the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Now, what's interesting is why doesn't the angel answer his question? Right? Gideon says, look, if God is for us and God is going to save us, where is he? The angel doesn't respond to that question, though. And it's fascinating when you see in 14, it says, the Lord turned to him. And so it's almost as if like the angel was talking to him, and then when Gideon started giving his response, it's like he turned away. And was just kind of like looking at the birds, just kind of like rolling his eyes. And then we see in 14, the Lord turned to him. And so it's like he was looking away, wasn't even listening. And it says, the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have. Am I not sending you? And it's like he doesn't even address what Gideon says. Why doesn't he answer the question? And this is a position, again, I think we find ourselves in often, where it's like, God, where are you? I'm in this tough spot, and you say you love me. You say you want me to serve you, and I'm doing my best here, but where are you? And that's where Gideon finds himself. God, where are you? Where have you been? And why doesn't he answer his question? But when you look at what he already said, what God said in the earlier part of the passage, when he sends that prophet and he says, look, I gave you one command and you didn't listen to it. This is a really important observation, I think, because when you find yourself in a position where God seems silent, one of the first things you should do is say, what's the last thing God said to me? I've had to do this multiple times where I'm looking for direction. I'm like, God, all right, why aren't you answering my prayer? Why aren't you speaking to me here? I'm really looking for direction for you in this area. But then I remember back, oh man, God said this, or God prompted me to do this, or God stirred in this area of my life, and I kind of ignored that. I said, okay, I appreciate that, God, but I'm a little more concerned with this part right here. Oftentimes when God is silent, it's because he's already spoken. It's because God has put something on your heart. He's led you in a direction you've said later. Not now. Or you've written it off. You say, that doesn't really make sense, God. So the next time you find yourself waiting on God, wondering why he's not speaking to you, why he's not giving you direction, ask yourself, what's the last thing that he told you to do? What's the last part of your life where he was moving? Maybe you need to go back there. And then God speaks. And it says this, that same night the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old, tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. So the very first thing that God then says to Gideon is the last thing he had told the Israelite people. Get rid of your idols. Stop worshiping other gods. So as Gideon's saying, God, where are you? Why aren't you speaking to us? God is very clearly saying, I have spoken to you. I already told you what you're supposed to do, and you're ignoring me. Stop worshiping idols. And we see they were in Gideon's home. And so Gideon, before he can do anything amazing, before he sets out on this adventure that God has for him, he's got to start by getting his home right. He has to tear the sin out of his home. And for some of us, that's where we need to start. Some of us, there have been idols that have been setting themselves up in our houses, in our families. And God is speaking. He's saying, you got to get rid of that. I have a great task for you. I've got work for you to do, but you've got idols set up in your house. You've got idols set up in your calendar that are keeping you from me. And this is where I'm going to have you start. And we see that happen with Gideon here. And in the midst of all this, Gideon is terrified. He's not just terrified because God tells him to tear down his household idols. His dad had built them, and the villagers there, they all worshiped them. And so this was a big deal. He actually does it at night. He's so afraid of the response of the people. But in the midst of all this, he keeps saying, are you really God? Are you really sending me? And God actually shows up and does some signs and wonders to prove himself to Gideon. And still, Gideon's terrified. Now the passage continues in 33. In chapter 6, verse 33. It says this, now the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet. So Gideon blows his trumpet when he sees all the enemies coming. He blows his trumpet, and he gathers all of Israel together. Now, this in itself is pretty miraculous. The Israelites had been trying to kind of fight back, but with little to no success. But now Gideon is able to call the armies together, and the people show up. The people don't go and hide. They actually show up to support Gideon, and there's a really big army that forms. And then as Gideon is there with this big army, he's camped across from the enemies. He's afraid, and he says this in verse 36. Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. And this is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. So we see Gideon testing God. He says, look, God, I know you brought this big army to me. And I know that we're ready for battle. I know that you've promised that we'll win. And I know that you've already shown me all these signs, that you've told me you'll be with me. You showed up in person, but I'm still afraid, and I don't know if I trust you. So give me this sign. And he's very specific. He doesn't say, give me a sign. He says, specifically, I'm going to put this garment out. I'm going to put this little shirt out here. And then if the ground around the shirt is dry, but the shirt itself is wet, then I'll believe you. Super specific. And the next morning he wakes up and he wrings it out, and it's wet, and all the ground around it was dry. God showed up and gave him a sign that he was asking for. But then Gideon responds and says, okay, now I'm going to put another shirt out, and if the shirt is dry but the ground is wet, and he asks for the opposite, and he says, if that happens, then I'll really trust you. And we don't see God roll his eyes. He probably did, but we don't see that. We see God just do it. The next morning, Gideon wakes up and he goes out, and the ground is soaked and the shirt is dry. So twice now, with the same miracle, God has proven himself. And again, this isn't the first time that he's done this with Gideon, and it's not going to be the last. Gideon is terrified, and he keeps asking for signs, and God keeps humoring him. Like at this point, I'm kind of annoyed with Gideon, right? Like it's like, dude, just trust him. And then it says this in the next chapter in 7, starting in verse 1. It says, early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. So God whittles Gideon's army down from 22,000 to 10,000. And he's not done. Next, he tells Gideon, hey, I want you to send all these 10,000 men down to the river to drink some water. And there's going to be two different types of people. Some are going to go onto their hands and knees and drink straight from the stream. Some are going to cup it with their hands and bring it up to their face while they're standing. And he says, the ones who cup the water, I want you to keep them in your army. The ones who go down on their hands and knees to drink, I want you to send them home. Guess how many people Gideon ends up with? 300. So he essentially, God whittles this army down from 22,000 people to 300. And God even says in the passage, your army is too big. Now that doesn't make sense. That's like going to your doctor and he's like, hey, you're a little too healthy. Like maybe consider smoking some cigarettes or drinking a little more because I'm not liking this chart. You're too healthy. Like that's not going to happen. You're not going to see that. And God yet says to Gideon, your army is too big. We're going to be doing a Christmas musical, and there's always that one kid. Like everyone's like well-behaved, but there's always that one kid who's like picking his nose or like smacking another kid. And imagine like you're the parent, and another parent comes up to you and says, your child is so well-behaved, right? Like you're being a great parent. But we see here that God says to Gideon, your army's too big. And it doesn't make sense because we look at this, we say, well, you would want a big army. Because that's how you win wars, when you have the superior forces. But God says your army's too big. And so God whittles it down, and then Gideon's left with 300. And so if Gideon was afraid before, he's going to be even more afraid now. But God says, look, I'm making your army smaller because I want you to know that it is me who's going to give you this victory. And this is an important thing because God will call us to do things that don't make sense. We see that here with Gideon. Oftentimes we want to say, well, I can't do this because it doesn't make sense. It's not going to work out for me. It's not going to work out financially. It's not going to work out for my schedule. So I know God probably wants me to do this, but because it doesn't make sense, I'm going to go with the brain that God gave me. God gave me a brain. He wants me to be reasonable. So I'm not going to do that. But this passage shows us crystal clear that God will tell us to do things that don't make sense. And oftentimes that stops us. Oftentimes that stops me. That God, you want me to do that? You want me to go here? That doesn't make any sense. Every year when we do our taxes, I always look at that number of the money, like tithing doesn't make sense. And I look at our year-end giving statement, I'm like, why are we giving all this money away? And tithing doesn't make sense financially. It just disappears. It's not like you're investing it in a stock. Like when you die, that tithing money is gone. From an earthly standpoint, tithing doesn't make sense. And there's a lot of things that we do as Christians that they don't make sense. And yet God will oftentimes speak to us and guide us and say, hey, I want you to go do this. I want you to go minister to this person. I want you to forgive this person. I want you to accept this pay cut. I want you to accept this job. And we say, God, that doesn't make sense. Like I have a plan, and this is outside of my plan. And yet we see God saying to Gideon, 22,000 men is too much. I want you to have 300. And Gideon obeys. And the next thing we see, in chapter 7, verse 8, it says this, now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night, the Lord said to Gideon, get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. And ultimately, we see Gideon is afraid. Gideon is afraid, and he does go down. So God says, look, I promise that you're going to win, but if you're afraid, you can go down, and I'll let you listen in and get some intelligence that will calm your mind. And so Gideon's like, okay, I need to go do that because I'm not certain anymore. And so Gideon goes down. And it says this in verse 13. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend of his dream. I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. That's kind of a strange dream. This man has a dream, and Gideon kind of sneaks into the camp, and he gets there just in time to overhear this exchange. And then one of the guards is speaking to the other guards. He says, man, I had this weird dream where this big bread roll, this Hawaiian roll came rolling down the hill, and it hit my house and knocked my house over. And then the friend's like, I know exactly what that dream means. That means that Gideon's going to come and defeat us. And it's not an interpretation that I would have come to, but it's enough for Gideon to hear that and say, wow, okay, God is going to save us. And so Gideon gets the assurance that God has for him, and then he does as God commands, and he gives every man a jar, a trumpet, and a torch. Usually if you're going to battle, you wouldn't take any of these into battle, but he gives them a jar, a trumpet, and a torch. And then he has these men surround the camp, and they've got the torch is lit, but the jars are over them to cover them. And then they've got a trumpet on their belt. And so what they do is at the same time, they take off the jar, exposing the light. They smash the jar on the ground. They pull the trumpet up, and they blast the trumpet. And this is what it says. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the Midianite camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth Shittah towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel-Meholah near Tabbath. And so we see that God's plan of sending these 300 men, it works, and it works in a way to where the entire enemy army is routed. And we see that Gideon finds victory. He defeats the Midianites, these people who had been oppressing Israelites for years. And then in one night, this whole camp is routed, and then in the next chapter, we see the Israelites chasing them across the country. Now, what fascinates me most about this passage, and what really drew me here to close out our series, is we have Gideon, who's called by God, and yet he continues to ask for these signs. And this is something that from the time, I remember when I was a kid, they put these on the little flannel in the nursery room, they put the story up. And I remember always being confused as to what's the deal with these signs? And I've had times where I'm like, should I ask God for signs? Lord, if I wake up tomorrow and there's a Maserati in my driveway, then I'll know. Then I'll know that you're for me. I should try that. But I've always been confused by these signs, right? Why is Gideon so specific? But even more so, why does God humor him? Why does God continue to put up with this lack of faith? I understand maybe the first sign or maybe the 2 fleece ones, but it gets to a point, it's dude, just trust God. He's showing up, he's doing these miraculous things, he's giving you an army, he's speaking to you. I've never heard the voice of God like that. He's speaking to you, and yet you're like, oh, God, I don't know. And I'm reminded, as I was reading this passage, I'm reminded of this interaction between Moses and God. When Moses comes across this burning bush in the desert, and Ari read this passage for us, and Moses starts arguing with God, and we see this back and forth. And Moses keeps saying, God, I don't know if this is going to work. And God keeps saying, all right, well, I'll do this, and that'll help you trust me, and that'll help the people trust me. And then Moses is like, that's cool, but also I don't know if this part's going to work. And Moses keeps questioning and doubting God, and God keeps giving him sign after sign. And then you get to the end, and I already read that for us, when Moses, after all these signs that God shows him, he literally said, Moses, throw your staff on the ground, and it turns into a snake. And at the end of all this back and forth, Moses still says, God, send someone else. I mean, the nerve. And we see that with Gideon too. This back and forth. Why does God permit this? But this tells us something really important. See, Gideon is terrified, and God cares. That's what this shows us. God is a king. God is so far above any demands or requests that we can make. I mean, imagine going to your boss, and he's like, hey, I want you to work overtime this Saturday. And you're like, okay, but how do I know you're going to pay me overtime? And he's like, well, we'll sign a contract. And you're like, well, okay, well, maybe give me half now and then half later. He's like, okay, I'll give you half now. And you're like, okay, well, maybe just give it all to me now, because I don't know if you're going to give me all my money. Your boss would be annoyed. He'd be mad at you. But this isn't a boss. This is God. And God is reasoning with Gideon. He doesn't need to. He could just say, Gideon, shut up and do your job. God could say that, and he would have every right to do that. But he doesn't. He doesn't. Gideon is afraid, and God cares. God lowers himself. He's not acting like a God here. He's acting like a friend. And this tells us something about God. When God sends us, when God sends Gideon, he cares, and he's with him every step of the way. Sometimes when we envision God sending us, we imagine him just kind of placing us at the top of a ski slope and saying, go. Like it's a black diamond, but you can trust me because I'm with you. And then we envision ourselves just standing there saying, all right, God, where are you? I'm going to try it. But that's not how it works. I remember when we got over to the bunny slopes, I saw all these parents with these harnesses, and they were skiing with their kids, and they had like their kids tied to them. It looked really dangerous, but a lot of parents were doing it. And so they had like this thing around their waist, and then it was like attached to the back of their kid's back by some kind of backpack thing. And there's a picture of it. And I saw a ton of these. And there were kids that were skiing well, but they had their parents with them every step of the way. And so sometimes we imagine God kind of just sending us, saying, all right, go. And me treating my wife like that is a poor representation of how God wants us to go. This is a better picture. You see, when God sends us, he is tied with us. And literally in the New Testament, Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. And he's talking about a yoke is this thing that oxen would put on. And it was this wooden harness. And two ox would wear this yoke. One would be on one side and the other would be on the other side. And they would be attached to each other through this harness. And Jesus is saying, I'm going to be yoked with you. So when God sends you, he's saying, look, I am with you. I'm not just watching from the ridge. I'm not just rooting for you from the stadium. I am with you. And we see that here with Gideon. Even when we're unfaithful, even when we don't trust him, even when we have nothing to offer, even when we failed him over and over again, God is with us. And when he sends you down that mountain, no matter how steep it is, no matter how alone you feel, God is with you every step of the way. And when you're anxious and when you're scared, God cares. And we see him show that love for Gideon. We see him show that love for Moses. And if you look back at your life and you look at the times when God stepped in, when you trusted him, you can see, man, God does care. He was looking out for me. So my encouragement to you, as we wrap up this series and as we get ready for the holiday season, and as you look at the areas in your life where you're just like, God, where are you? Why don't you care? Why aren't you with me? I want to challenge you. Ask yourself, what's the last thing God told you? What's the last thing he commanded you? Where's the last direction that he pointed for you to go? And there's a reason you ignored it. It's scary. Doesn't make sense. But God will call us to do things that don't make sense, but we can trust absolutely that when God does call us to do something, especially when it doesn't make sense, that he will be with you every step of the way. I'm going to invite the band up. And as the band comes up, I want us to take a couple minutes here to just pray. Just pray to yourself. And I want you to search. And I want you to ask yourself, what's the last thing God told you to do? What's the last direction he pointed you in? What's the last command that he gave you? And if you can't think of it, then say, God, what do you want from me? And so I want to invite you, we're going to take just 60 seconds here. I want to invite you to bow your heads and close your eyes and just seek God in this time. And carry that into the worship. David's going to start playing after about a minute. And as the worship continues, I want to encourage you to take that question to God.